It's a real special pleasure for me to join you this afternoon for a lecture by Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford. He, as you know, is the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. Before I say a few words about our distinguished speaker, let me share with you why his visit is so important to us and why it is especially significant. His lecture today honors two important initiatives at Yale. As many of you know, when I became president in 2013, I announced the Yale Africa Initiative. In fact, it was in my inaugural address. And I said that with the growing influence of the African continent on the world economy, as well as the increase in migration to and from and within Africa, it was an important moment to bring scholarship and teaching about Africa at Yale into sharper focus. And so, working collaboratively, we knew that we could foster new directions in research on Africa, identify new partnerships with those on the continent, strengthen our recruitment efforts, all while emphasizing teaching and learning. And so in 2018, I was thrilled to be able to meet with key partners and stakeholders in that initiative in Ghana and in Kenya. And from conversations that came out of that visit and others with African leaders and scholars and alumni, I learned about just how diverse our research and educational partnerships in Africa were and could become, and how we could advance shared goals concerning new knowledge, concerning important discoveries, and maybe most importantly, preparing the next generation of leaders. So I continue to feel strongly that our engagement with Africa should be an important dimension to the university's mission, a mission that you know is about research, about teaching, about preservation, and practice. I'm very proud of the fact that just since that initial speech in 2013, we've doubled the number of African students and scholars on this campus. We've launched new partnerships in and with African universities. 4 African universities, for example, have joined the School of Management's Global Network for Advanced Management. Pericles Lewis, our Vice President for Global Strategy, will be going to Africa this year. I will likely go back in a year from now, and I feel that we're really on a roll. Most importantly, though, those are genuine partnerships. We look for opportunities where we can offer something, African university or institution or agency can offer something, and we both do something together that we wouldn't have done separately. It's wonderful that this lecture is taking place in partnership with the Council on African Studies here at the Macmillan Center. This is the council, I think many of you know, many of you are affiliated with it, that is focused on teaching and research on all things Africa and is a key partner for the Yale African Initiative. I should also point out, for those of you who don't know, Eddie Mandry is sitting right here, and he is the Office of International Affairs Director for the African Initiative. And for those of you who have never met him but have some ideas about partnerships, he is your guy to talk to. I sense by your chuckles you all know who he is. So I will also say, if you see us later, Eddie and I did not coordinate on our ties today, although he is wearing the green version of the same tie I'm wearing today in a blue version. Dr. Casely-Hayford's visit also honors another kind of partnership, and that's with the Smithsonian. That is an enduring partnership. Yale and the Smithsonian have a deep and abiding commitment to collaborative work. And this extends back to the earliest days of these institutions. So James Dwight Dana, a Yale College graduate and later a member of our faculty, was the mineralogist and geologist of the United States Exploring Expedition, whose collections form the basis of the founding of the Smithsonian institutions. O.C. Marsh, who is a Yale graduate, our first professor of paleontology, was the first federal paleontologist appointed to the U.S. Geological Survey. Half of his collection is on this campus, and half of it forms a collection within the Smithsonian. So if you look at dinosaurs there or dinosaurs here, you are basically looking at Marsh's excavations. In 2016, we formalized a new partnership with the Smithsonian. In addition to conservation and the protection of cultural heritage that is threatened worldwide, our new alliance also focuses on the digital humanities, on race and human diversity, and on climate change. I think there are going to be ripple effects of our collaboration that extend beyond the two institutions, especially through public education and through other kinds of outreach where we celebrate and share our core objectives. So as the director of the nation's premier museum devoted to the arts of Africa from antiquity to the present, Dr. Casely-Hayford knows better than anyone else the importance of preserving the heritages and legacies of so many generations. He joined the museum in February 2018, brought with him a wealth of experience writing, lecturing, and broadcasting on Africa's arts and cultures. He was born in London. He was educated at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and he received his doctorate there in African history. He sits on the board of several arts institutions, and in 2018, he was presented with an Order of the British Empire Award for his work on Africa. Dr. Casely-Hayford is a prominent expert on African arts and has been featured on the BBC, including 2 seasons of the popular Lost Kingdoms of Africa television series, as well as a 2017 TED Global Talk, which focused on the powerful stories that shape Africa. And this TED Talk has been viewed by over a million viewers. He's the author of a new Ladybird expert book, Timbuktu, and I can't tell you how thrilled we are that you are joining us here today at Yale. Let us welcome Dr. Casely-Hayford.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, let me take my talk, but not yours.
It's wonderful to be here. And I was coming up the East Coast on the train yesterday, and I was following on Twitter this huge bank of snow that was barreling up the coast behind us. And the previous talk that I did was actually in Chicago, and it was over that weekend, it was minus 20, and I didn't actually know that the temperature could go down that far. And the lake froze over. And so it's something obviously to do with me. So I apologize before I start for the weather. But the warmth of the reception that I've got here has been the fantastic counterbalance to the weather. I just want to thank everyone. It's a great honor to be here. I mean, I've followed the work of so many of the academics that have worked for Yale, and to visit it has always been a dream. And I want to thank Marta and Peter, who've hosted me just so wonderfully, so warmly. All our colleagues at Yale. It's just been a glorious visit. And also my dear colleagues from the Smithsonian who've accompanied me, and also who are a fantastic illustration of the breadth and the complexity of the partnerships that our 2 institutions enjoy. And I want to be a part of that. I'm fairly new in post, but I look forward to engaging in rich partnerships over many years of my tenure. And I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I couldn't be more honoured or delighted. I know the quality of the intellectual investment that you've made this institution in Africa. And I've followed the successful delivery of the Yale Africa initiative. And I know the particular personal investment that you, Peter, have made of being in that unique position of being the only Ivy League president to have professionally visited Africa, to invested so much in building relationships with the continent. And I know from the responses from across a variety of different sorts of institutions, different sorts of people across the African continent, how valued your commitment has been. Thank you. Thank you so much for your leadership. And I come here, this is my first time, but I feel so at home here. And before I start, I think I want to share something that I'm really passionate about, a real passion of mine, something that I adore. And my role is equal parts crazy and equal parts wonderful and inspirational. And there are moments when I have to escape my office, and there are a few things that I've come to quietly rely upon. And before I start my day, or if I find a few moments between meetings, you'll often find me, because I retreat to the gallery to visit these old friends, these two stately, weathered figures. They once sat either side of a Nigerian slit gong. It's a century-old wooden drum that was designed to speak. To hear the sound of a well-played gong at close quarters is something that, at least in my mind, is hard to forget. It's like thunder rolling across your rib cage, and it creates it's a very particular sound, deep, sonorous tones that were conceived to open up a very special and particular realm of communication, a sphere of music and poetry which is sometimes so deeply and potently organic that it can weave a palpable link between drummer and listener, between drummer and history, between listener and message, calling people to dance while simultaneously forming the rhythm of the dance itself, binding communities together with drummed messages, with histories, with proverbs. And in spite of consciously trying not to have favourites, these wonderful objects seem to draw me back again and again. And I know that you have a drum of a similar age in the collection here from the same region. And these are beguiling things. And slit logs or drums, they are in one sense the simplest of musical instruments. And that simplicity is their wonder. Like all drums, when force is brought to bear upon a surface, a kind of percussive energy is transmitted through the atmosphere to impact the tympanic membrane of the middle ear. But then these drums, they have a surprise for you, hitting the listener with a secondary wave of sound, an energy that resonates up through the ground, rising up through the solar plexus into the chest cavity. And the effect, it's immediate and it's utterly intoxicating. When these aural explosions are combined and arranged into passages, it's utterly thrilling. It can feel like the purest analogue of being itself. I mean, our bodies, they crave rhythms. Beats mirror the explosions in the deepest muscles of the heart. We relish their immutability, their irreducibility, their energy. We know to anticipate the rise of an impending beat. We crave the sensation of the impact of a tone on the air and lament the collapse of a sound when we're left in that very particular oral vacuum between beats as tone gives way to potent momentary silence. It's the most basic epistemological statement. After a beat, by logical necessity, there must be that space in which the beat can be. There must be silence, the chance to catch a breath, to regain our composure. And drummers in this part of Nigeria, they really know what they're doing. They know how to play and control that silence in its varied and creative forms. Silence is important. In much traditional African music, the lacuna, the skip in a beat, or a momentary silence is significant not just because of it's a mechanical break in the sound, but because of what it can uniquely invoke for the listener. In many of the most celebrated African drumming languages, silence is not seen as the field upon which sound is placed. Silence is an equal and active component of overall composition. What can be suggested by the quality of a momentary silence is completely unique. And some African drummers, they've taken that idea of an active silence to its extraordinary conclusion. They've learned to collude with the silence and the interference between multiple rhythms, to collaborate with that alter rhythm, to entice it from the aural shadows, finessing and focusing patterns of particular sounds. And even though no single drummer might control these rhythms, this distinct field of resonance is said to have a dynamic and responsive quality all of its own. It's been called by many musicologists the inside rhythm. It's a ghostly musical presence that seems to manifest itself within musical space and silences. And the mechanics and the history of the inside rhythm are somewhat mysterious, but the politics of silence, for me, sits at a nexus of significant cultural phenomena connected to omitted histories, to lost narrative, and to marginalization. Silence, loss, and omission in African history are powerful things. Foucault wrote memorably about the relationship between power and knowledge, about how the label of madness had been used to systematically silence the poor. Well, for peoples of African descent, we've had to deal with similarly pervasive and destructive connotations and labels which have been used to malign and silence us. Indeed, for many peoples of African descent who suffered through enslavement, through colonialism, and the destruction and confiscation of drums, drums became a powerful analogue of that loss of voice. And perhaps what makes this object so poignant, that draws me back to it again and again, is that sense of that lingering, ghostly inside rhythm. And whilst the pain of the intolerable silence of these instruments can be poignant, we can work to retell the stories of the figures that once sat upon them, to make them sing again. We know, or we can deduce something of this particular drum's story from the weather-worn surface of the carved figures. We know that it probably reached the end of its useful life, but although it was divided into pieces and long separated, through collaborative research, we can give these glorious objects back some life. We can reunite them with their story. We can find that inside rhythm, that lingering rhythm, the archaeology of the story that might have been lost. For more than 3 decades, the left-hand figure, mottled with and weathered, the left-hand figure, which is a female figure, sitting with her baby in her cross lap. It was carved by an Mbembe artist in southeast Nigeria. And it's been a major part of our collection for a number of years. But a few years ago, the female figure was sent on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was placed adjacent to a figure from a collection in Germany. And like long-lost twins, they seem to immediately connect. And through considerable collaborative research, through multi-continental consultation, through dendrochronology, we were able to confirm that these 2 wooden figures, thought to be late 19th century, likely sat back to back at either end of a massive slit gong. And although they belong together, reuniting them was simultaneously odd. They sit back to back, as if just after a row, yet they're also obviously a couple locked together in love. Like so much West African art, they are balanced, opposing forces that tell a kind of dynamic truth because of that opposition. Knowing that we could reunite the couple, one male, one female, to repose them in their eternal feud is thrilling. The drum might have been silenced, the figures might not be talking, but good museology has made them sing. Although they make no sound, they've left an exquisite, lingering, poignant inside rhythm. The Enlightenment philosophers who crafted the intellectual culture that underpins both conventional museology and academia simply excluded Africa from the pantheon of classical civilizations. Its most respected members, men like Hegel and Kant, figures like Locke and Hume, wrote that when they looked to Africa to find recognizable forms of intellectual tradition, they simply couldn't find what they sought. And the cultural archaeology of that historic, willful blindness to African intellectual achievement, that silencing of African voices is still evidence. Its legacy still impacts our understanding of the world, and the cultural sector has seemingly been a willing ally of this system of exquisitely crafted racism. Within our lifetimes, respected museums have overtly or implicitly accommodated social Darwinism. We have, as a sector, even housed taxidermied human beings to illustrate racial hierarchies. And many institutions continue to deal poorly with problematic historic collections. These things leave a lingering odour over our discipline. Our sector continues to be weighed down by difficult issues that haunt us, that limit our ability to be effective in ways that we know that we should. And that archaeology of historic racism is only made worse by our sector's inability to deal with ongoing structural inequalities. A recent research project led by the Smithsonian surveyed natural history museums across the world and was able to quantify something that we probably all intuit. The natural history museums of Europe and North America are home to more than 90% of the agglomerated global collection. Yet, ironically, the source for a high proportion of those objects is the global south. It's a stark and uncomfortable reality. The vast majority of what we see in our most celebrated natural history museums was collected in regions with the weakest educational and museological provision. The inequalities we see mapped out in global economics are reflected in exaggerated forms in museums. The most well-off continue to benefit from the cultural and intellectual blessings of the least well-off. We see that vividly replicated in African visual arts, where the huge imbalances in resource, in quality, and in scale of collections in many parts of the continent seem to imperil Africans from delivering meaningfully around African art, telling the story of African art. And when one looks at regional or state collections, compares them between Africa and Europe, it's difficult to travel in the region as an academic and hold one's head up high. In Europe and North America, ironically, conversely, the sheer scale, the sheer complexity of key collections creates challenges of display, of storage, of interpretation. The silence imposed by colonialism, by slavery, by what has followed, has not been alleviated. Critical areas of African culture remain imperiled, stifled, or overlooked. Our museum spent some time reflecting on and surveying the African museum sector, and the resulting collected data tells a story of chronic under-resourcing, of areas of abject neglect, but also of pockets of enduring hope, of excellence, and shoots of genuine wonder. Many African museums were in substantive part established to fulfill a function for colonial administrations, trying to make sense of regions to their often disparate and often disaffected inhabitants. Between 1850 and the end of the First World War, it was the period of the most intense expansion of museums. It's also a generation in which museums that are focused around heritage come into being. And they seem to reflect and rationalize what is happening with empire. And with the end of the First World War and the beginning of the disintegration of the colonial machine, there was investment in the first generation of dedicated archaeology and art museums. These were institutions that began to meaningfully acknowledge African intellectual creative prowess, to create room for individual artistic virtuosity and for regional distinctiveness. And they were subsequently joined between independence and the present day by a new kind of African art museum, institutions that sought to be seen as platforms for the promotion of post-colonial narratives. And they consciously forged new histories, promoted African movements, art movements, and also offered platforms for discrete artists. And it's fascinating, in my mind, to see the discrete shifts across time. I mean, what we did here was to actually think about what was it that drove the creation of these museums. And you begin to get a sense of how the creation of museums was a process that was deeply instrumentalized. And it looks even more particular when one looks across the period and looks at the years in which more than 3 museums came into being. You get a sense of the reasons why museums were being instituted. The main periods are the years leading up to the First World War, just before the Second World War, alongside independence, during the collapse of apartheid. It seems that with each discrete political shift, museums were created to reflect the moment, and often to speak to, rather than to speak for, communities. But over the course of history, if the data tells a single story, it's of the inexorable growth of the art museum. And the burgeoning of these art museums has been mirrored with changes in international markets, with the rise of African art colonies and African art collectives, and the growth of more globally minded dealers and gallerists who've begun to look to Africa for new ideas. And they've attracted collectors who in recent years have seen spectacular returns on their investments, as once niche artists have joined a generation of international art superstars. African art has become cool, and the best African art newsworthily expensive. But as ever, the main beneficiaries of these changes have been audiences, have been collectors, have been institutions beyond the continent. I mean, this is wonderful, and it's simultaneously frustrating. And we've seen similar kinds of shifts with parallel manifestations in many areas of creative expression. Where does someone like Jay-Z sample his most radical riffs and rhythms? Where does Beyoncé borrow her dance steps? Hollywood look for its Marvel superheroes. Fashion borrow its most vivid textiles. Africa is cool. It's exploding with ideas, with talent, and that energy has percolated out beyond the trendy to reset the mainstream. And whilst you can visit the global art fairs and see this phenomenon vividly reflected in the state-sponsored African museum sector, it just simply hasn't managed to resonate all the way through to the museums that matter. Much of the wider sector is failing or struggling. And this is frustrating. But placed in its historical context, it's more than frustrating. It feels wrong. In the opening scenes of Black Panther, there's a robbery at a barely disguised British museum, and there's a moment when Eric Killmonger Stevens, played by Michael B. Jordan, and he stands in front of a museum display and he's examining a selection of carvings, and then the museum director approaches. And I was talking to this about this to my colleague Chris, and the thing that she really was annoyed about was the museum director was drinking a cup of tea at the time as well. So you know this is an appalling museum director. But anyway. And she approaches and she offers to tell Killmonger about the works. And Killmonger, he quickly stops and he corrects her. And he explains that a 7th century war hammer wasn't actually Fuller, as he says. It was taken by the British soldiers in Benin, but actually it's from Wakanda. And then, because in my mind I could do this with an American accent, but I'm not sure I have the guts to actually do that in front of you. And in a British accent, it really sounds bad, but you have to forgive me. He says, "Don't trip." You see, it just really sounds bad, doesn't it? "Don't trip," he says. "I'm going to take it off your hands for you." And when the museum director protests and says that the work isn't for sale, Killmonger retorts, "How do you think your ancestors got these? Do you think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?" And when I saw the film, the audience at that point spontaneously cheered. Somehow, the African museum sector has become the pantomime villain. And for me, it's difficult, it's impossible for me to digest that. We have such an important story to tell. The oldest story of art, the least appreciated and most underinvested. We simply cannot afford to carry this additional stigma. Habermas wrote very affectingly about how institutions and state suffer a natural kind of erosion of legitimacy over time if they do not constantly and robustly interrogate and nuance their priorities. We've got to think about ways in which we can interrogate our priorities, our values, our remit. And Habermas said that if you don't do that, it leads inevitably to a kind of disenchantment. And perhaps that is what is begun to happen to our sector. And I think one senses that some significant figures within the sector, that they feel that too. They've accepted that this is a time for us to address a long overdue constellation of issues and address them head on, to really examine our profession, its past, and the possibilities for the future. In France, a report recently commissioned by President Emmanuel Macron recommended the full restitution by the French museums of all works in state collections taken without consent from former African colonies. Macron, he seems determined to personify a new political generation that has no links to the colonial moment. And he has inspired a fascinating study that argues for the complete transfer of property back to Africa unless it can be proven that these objects were acquired legitimately. The report squarely places the burden of proof of legitimate acquisition on museums. African nations, states, municipalities, individuals do not have to petition and prove a valid claim. The German government, inspired by the French, have allocated 1.9 million euros this year to provenance research for artifacts that entered their national museum collections during the colonial era. An 8-member committee, including 2 of the co-writers of the French report, will select grant recipients on the basis of applications from German museums. It's a very interesting time. However, the most important European museums haven't responded with open arms to this. Stéphane Martin, the president of Quai Branly, the French National Museum of Non-Western Art, which holds around 70,000 African works, he has pushed back, arguing against maximal restitution, saying he would prefer the increased circulation of African art in French collections rather than their wholesale return. He wants to see more exhibitions, more exchanges, loans, deposits, and cooperation. This has coincided with a moment when the British Museum, that has long led the charge in curatorial training on the continent, has chosen to step back from its work as its African department has been pared back. Simultaneously, in Belgium, they have reconditioned their old Royal Museum of Central African Art in Tervuren. I'm sure you know it's a suburb of Brussels. And they've invested $84 million in a new suite of galleries to retell the story of Belgium's deeply problematic history of brutal Central African colonialism. And it's had a kind of unforeseen, at least by them, set of outcomes. It's reopened debates about colonial-era genocide, about government-sponsored plundering, and restitution. And the present King of Belgium, a descendant of Leopold, when asked to, decided he wasn't going to attend the opening. And rather than offer catharsis, it has inspired anger. In this moment of generational change, there seems to be a lack of strategic thinking or an enthusiasm to grasp the opportunities from important agencies. We need to talk. Our sector needs to convene meaningful conversations about collections, about partnerships, about loan arrangements, and so much more. Whether full-scale return occurs or not, we must work to address the imbalance in resource, to find ways to open channels for better partnerships. Whilst European institutions are shifting their focus, the wider sector should not slow the momentum. There is so much more work to be done in Africa if we are not to be left in a generation thinking that this was a lost opportunity to truly rebuild our sector to the benefit of everyone. And one has to ask, what is the state of the current publicly sponsored sector in Africa? And if Western museums were to institute a campaign of meaningful restitution, if museums in the West want to begin to build loan arrangements and acquisition agreements, are African museums, even those beyond the state sector, and their personnel in a position to really benefit? Well, we examine the present sector, and the overwhelming unevenness is the big takeaway. Africa boasts a handful of the very best museums in the world. If you have the opportunity, visit Zeitz Moka or the Norval Foundation in South Africa, both newly opened, and it's hard not to react with awe. But they sit within a wider state-sponsored art museum ecology that remains stubbornly patchy. There are a new generation of Chinese-funded state museums, like the Museum of Black Civilizations in Senegal. But around them, many of the original colonial and independence-era museums have fallen into disrepair. Some have been shuttered, and others are poorly visited, and few are in a position to truly safeguard collections. A handful are in a position to take on loans or broker meaningful partnerships. These things have to change. And the paucity of art history courses, and which are attached to museums or universities, means that narrative is often initiated and crafted by figures beyond the continent. As ever, the markers of success and recognition continue to be arbitrated by foreigners. This is frustrating, but perhaps there are things that we might do. It might be the particular convergence of nascent possibilities offer a generational opportunity to build the sector that we would all be proud to be part of. It's an inexact science, but we utilize the reviews on TripAdvisor as an approximate relative measure of the popularity of museums. And we agglomerated the data to enable us to quickly gauge the relative scale of audiences and their visitors' reactions. The results surprised me. The national wealth and size of population are not a reflection of Africa's national museums' health. Nigeria, Africa's wealthiest nation, a country with a history of astounding visual arts production and home to some of the continent's most successful contemporary visual artists, has strangely delivered a kind of uneven sector. And it's generally under-resourced and it has a poorly visited state-sponsored museum sector. And yet at the same time, nations like Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, they boast pockets of really well-visited, well-run and well-loved museums. And whilst this unevenness of provision is concerning, this continental and national patchiness could be the basis of real hope. These figures suggest that where talented professionals with reasonable collections are given a chance, they seem to thrive. Where governments support the sector and that resource is catalysed by talented professionals, magic has really happened. Even in regions where there's been little audience development and communications investment, the quality of personnel combined with collection has made the crucial difference. Occasionally that spark can be triggered at the very top. In Benin, the president has led the charge for substantive change. Looking at the figures, it's stark. We need to help where we can and where we're wanted. To be there for those near isolated institutions and individuals who are effectively driving the sector and doing so with little resource or acknowledgement. We must try to grow, to partner, to mentor and work with these wonderful centres of excellence. But mostly we need to listen, to learn how we might change to be better partners. We need a kind of sectorial group therapy. We need to negotiate new ways of working together. We must invest in mechanisms to build trust, to develop shared goals and forge a basis for better future collaboration. We are, after all on the same side, the side of art, of our audiences, of the sector. But there are important issues to be addressed. Even if we accept Stephen Martin's somewhat conservative interpretation of the Macron report, one of partial restitution, of shared programs of exhibitions, of exchanges, of loans, of deposits and cooperations. Even in that pared-back manifestation of sectorial adaptation, there will need to be profound, massive changes in African museums to accommodate these opportunities if we are not at some point to feel that this was a missed opportunity. Felwan Sarr, an economist at Gaston Berger University in Saint Louis, Senegal. He's the man who oversaw the research for the Macron report. He said that we're proposing a framework that takes into account the time restraints of the requesting nations. We don't want to impose a vast quantity of restituted objects on any country. We want to make sure that they actually want restitution, that they are prepared for it, and they are in a position to organise for it. They hope that restitution will actually begin this year, and between now and 2022, a programme of return would have been delivered. For a nation like Benin, that will mean the development and reconditioning of a whole suite of museums between now and, well, now actually, there's no time at all. The training of a new generation of experts, and there are plans in place to deliver this, but there is a daunting amount to do. And the British Museum, that they've said that they'll consider everything except repatriation of objects. And they've recently agreed to a loan of 300 objects to the Benin Museum. They've agreed to share their database, but this is only the beginning, as they say. But this happens simultaneously as a museum service in Lagos suffers a funding shortfall. It does feel like we're moving toward a substantive sectorial shift without the provisions in place to make it sustainable. We simply cannot afford to waste this generational opportunity. I recently lamented in a long phone call with a colleague at the British Museum. We reflected on how this could be a wonderful moment of sectorial renaissance with new museums like the J.K. Randall Centre in Lagos, with courses like the new course at the Institute of Museum Studies at Jos, or the Legon Museum Studies course. But at the same time, there are no new trained staff to facilitate the needed change. There's limited resource on the ground, and there are tightening budgets. How will things satisfactorily evolve? We remain, as ever, hopeful, and we are very active. At the moment, we're working most meaningfully in Nigeria, Benin, and Kenya. In Benin, we've been invited to help them consider how they might reintegrate objects repatriated from the French national collections, to consider how they will form the basis of a number of new and refurbished museums. And it's a bold project that will require considerable support and training across every area of traditional museum delivery. But there's also the possibility for the Benin Museum authorities to build a new museum model, for their curators to deploy new interpretive methodologies, for the education programs to be based on new pedagogy. There's no reason for them to develop museums that are exactly like ours. Perhaps they'll be inspired by the mobile phone-invested young audiences to renew the museum paradigm. This could be a chance for the whole sector to grow. And we know that these projects take time. We've worked for a decade now in Edo State in southern Nigeria, working with museum specialists and officials from the Benin Court on a shared exhibition program. And we've seen the real benefits of long-term partnership. In Kenya, we're supporting the development of a new national art museum, through which they hope to rebuild East African art histories. East Africa boasts some of the most astounding contemporary artists, but has been historically very, very poorly served by its state institutions, and that will change. As the British Museum withdraws its support from these regions, there is an increasingly stark need. And if you have any doubt, look online and observe how few national museums in Africa have functional websites on a continent with a very digitally invested population. If you get the chance, visit. Look at how few have environmental controls as climate change impacts buildings ever more corrosively. How few have educational programs on a continent with a rapidly growing under 25-year-old demographic. It's concerning. We at the National Museum of Art are a small institution of 36 permanent staff. But even the possibility of our engagement with the National Museum Service in Kenya and in Benin has garnered ministerial support. In the case of Benin, the president has been involved. It's because this is needed. This is wanted. We presently partner with African museums as resource allows, but we would love to partner with others to do significantly more. And that's why I'm here. I've seen the power of your Africa initiative, and I would love to learn more. It represents a wonderful model for sectoral intervention, a means of working across multiple areas of delivery to support change. Imagine if we were to apply similar techniques to the museum sector, to augment skills of museum experts, perhaps with skills from the business school. Imagine what that could bring. Imagine the change that might be possible. Whilst working alone, we as a national museum, we can tenably try to support a handful of African museums in reshaping institutional visions. We can work on the development of their archives, of their libraries, and their conservation laboratories. We can suggest curatorial and museological approaches, perhaps even help with digital communication strategies. But imagine if we could supplement that provision with legal, with financial, with development, with buildings and management advice as needed. Imagine if we could work with the business and management schools that have knowledge to support the development of the African public sector. We could transform lives. Both Yale and the Smithsonian have significant strength, presence, and networks in Africa. If we were to collaborate on this, it would offer a chance to deliver at a new level of impact. We are perfect partners. There are synergies in values, in history, in aims, and built into the mission and culture of both institutions is a record of leveraging the power of mutually beneficial partnerships and global networks to solve the problems around the world. And I look forward to seeing future Yale and Smithsonian scholars working in Africa to strengthen institutions through great leadership. I know that Yale and Smithsonian scholars are leading the global consortium for the preservation of cultural heritage, driving collaboration and mutual integration among members to assure the development of the best conditions for the preservation of the things that we love. Our hope is that the consortium will power the global university through broad educational programs, through major collaborative research initiatives, and effective engagement and advocacy. But imagine if we were to build on that model, to create a sector-wide consortium to drive real change and collaboration in the museum sector. This might be a dream, but it could begin simply with talking, testing the possibilities. Imagine if we were to initially co-host a discussion somewhere in Africa and use it as an opportunity to see if there might be an appetite for some meaningful initiatives. Perhaps we could test the possibility of the development of combined courses in museums management or dynamic research degrees in which the students were invested experts who could learn while sharing their unique knowledge. But first, we've got to start talking. In a survey of African museum experts just last year, most museum professionals saw opportunities to convene and collaborate as a key aspiration. 98% wanted to see a more active museums environment and spaces where ideas and questions could be shared, but they don't have the means to facilitate it. We could convene a discussion and gather expertise from across Africa, Europe, and North America to consider where we are and where we would like to be. In the longer term, those discussions might catalyse the development of university-supported courses, or we might convene a shared digital space, or perhaps a virtual centre of expertise, a space where we could learn from each other and lift all boats together. We could, as we have in Benin and Kenya, work with ministers and senior civil servants, perhaps starting in pilot areas, with the hope of working more widely across the continent and beyond in building solutions and networks to facilitate deep sectoral change. And for those who sit outside our pilot areas, for those who couldn't afford to travel, we could develop digital resources for reference, and we could build the digital infrastructure for dynamic engagement and partnership. We could see this as a wonderful opportunity to engage with the vast new communities of digitally engaged museum professionals across the continent, but more widely with those who are simply open, many of whom will never have the opportunity to travel, but with whom we can share the vast pleasure and burden of reinterpreting and reanimating our discipline for the 21st century. We could, for the very first time, unite communities of interest that are separated by geography, but linked by passion. And we can spend the time to deliberate on the knotty problems, or we could allow ourselves to be led by the macro sector defining topics. The choices are ours. The Smithsonian, the reason I joined, it was created for the dissemination, for the diffusion of knowledge. We were contrived in major part as a cultural mechanism to change hearts and minds, to inspire and lift discourse. And today we have the tools in our hands, the tools available to us to deliver to our original remit at a scale and with a flexibility unimaginable to our forebears. We can, as a national museum, engage meaningfully in truly global conversations. And for me, the idea that the benefit of museum collections should be the preserve of those limited few who live within the proximity of a well-funded museum, that our thinking should be driven and directed toward the financially or the educated or the educationally privileged, I think that runs counter to the spirit upon which most modern museums were founded. And through this program, we wouldn't just widen the benefit. We could give back to the very communities from which our collections were drawn. I think Smithson, as a Brit who gave money to fund a museum in a country he had never visited because he wanted to catalyse learning, I think he would have liked that. Much of this isn't new, not the problems, nor indeed the obvious solutions. In the 90s, in response to criticism from many constituencies, the World Bank began including environmental groups and NGOs in its loans to mitigate some of the past effects of its development policies. And then very briefly, it looked at culture in Africa, at how it might be a catalyzing force for delivering both meaningful development and for shifting hearts and minds. And beyond UNESCO's brief of preservation and education, the World Bank saw an additional role for culture as important in fostering social cohesion, a kind of social cohesion that underpins healthy economies. Many argued that in the West, culture was treated and nurtured as an industry, and it seemed to work. And when supported through education, through state sponsorship of blue ribbon projects, it was an important component of a successful economy, of a cohesive society. And what those successful Western museums shared was being meaningfully relevant to their constituents. There was a World Bank recommendation as part of that report that African museums should no longer blindly imitate Western models, but they should become something of their own, tools for the improvement of their own communities, evolving into flexible entities, able to facilitate and celebrate both material and intangible heritage in their own way. And there was hope, there was a kind of hope that beyond culture, museums might grow to potentially address issues like health, like urbanization, like environmental degradation and political evolution, and they could become engines for real catharsis and drive social cohesion. That 1990s vision, that World Bank vision, it remains a good one. With the explosion of digital possibilities, the potential for museum engagement has been further transformed. These programs sadly went out of favour with the era of the NGO in the late 90s. But I think we need to rescue the baby from the discarded bathwater. We need to remake the economic case for investment in African heritage. I believe that arts and heritage could be a driver for real social cohesion and national stability in many areas of Africa. It could become a real engine of job creation, and also it could impact directly subsidiary sectors. It has the potential to deliver even wider economic benefits. And think of how it might impact tourism. And delivering deep sectorial change, it's only in part about money. Our sector has delivered a number of these kinds of training programs over generations to attempt to alleviate these seemingly intractable problems. And we've worked to refurbish and to develop real estate and facilities in a variety of regions. But limited training and infrastructure schemes simply have proven not to be enough. There have been countless schemes to train personnel, to invest in talent. However, none have looked at the sector holistically. None have had the benefit of such a favourable political landscape or the possibility of restitution. Also, we've never had such a favourable cultural ambience, a moment when change is categorically less challenging than stasis. This is an exceptional opportunity for us to adjust the fundamental model of our discipline, the nature of ambition, and the very tenor of what we do. And as ever, it's not just Africans that need to adapt. We must all learn to be better partners, to reconfigure models of ownership and collaboration, to perhaps allow time and space to grieve, to express anger, maybe remorse, but critically to rebuild trust, respect, and understanding. We must invest in making the sector feel united by accepted standards, by ethical codes, by considering sectorial values. through nurturing sympathetic cultures and underlying an underlying shared love of African art, I think we can build a new sort of respect for each other. And I began by describing the loss of narrative, of voice. Well, please, let's start talking. Let's fill the void with voices. And although it's tempting, please let's not retreat. Let's hear from the old wise heads, but also let's make space for new voices, for new ideas. Let's listen to the long ignored and the quiet. Let's together craft a new moment, convene a shared conversation, truly shape and to reshape our understanding of African art. The perverse imbalance in resource, in expertise and in collections between museums on the continent and those beyond, it doesn't just damage museums in Africa. The very moral authority of many museums across the Western world has been quite rightly questioned by many who feel that change is long overdue. Please, let's listen. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions, and then I want to invite you upstairs for a reception where we have a little more informal interchange. Questions, please.
I'm fascinated by the story of the African Museum in Washington. It was long in coming,
Yes.
and yet I ask, how did it evolve, and how did you get it off? How was it gotten off the ground, and where did all the money come from?
Our museum, National Museum of African Art, is really, I mean, like so many museums, it's the drive of a single individual, Warren Robbins, and he recognized in African art, particularly if you imagine that this was in the early 60s, that there could be a mechanism for catalyzing discussion between polarized communities within Washington and beyond. And if you imagine 1963, 64, that this is the moment of new human rights legislation, of new race relations legislation, of Roe versus Wade, huge changes in the way in which we understood how we dealt with one another. And he wanted to broker through culture a new opportunity for us to think about our relationship to Africa, and particularly as a mechanism for empowering peoples of African descent. And that was its initial focus. And it was conceived with incredible ambition from its very beginning, because within a couple of years of being opened, that a piece of art, the Afo Akom, which was a wonderful Cameroonian wooden sculpture, was stolen from a shrine in Cameroon, and it ends up in North America, and it is figures in and around our museum that fight for the return of that object, that try to raise the money for its acquisition, for its return. And so I think from its very beginning, it was driven by this idea of engagement with the continent, of equitable relationships, not of collecting voraciously for its own sake, but of finding ways of building relationships that were really meaningful. But particularly doing that to drive the idea of Africa being a culture that we should all have knowledge of and engage with. And I think Warren Robbins, our founder, if he were alive today, he would be wanting us to use digital engagement. He would be wanting us to form those partnerships on the continent so that we can broker a new moment in which we deliver that vision, but deliver it at a sort of global level of delivery.
I first would like to thank you so much for talking about this subject. Because I remember when I first came to New Haven and I went to the Yale Art Gallery and seeing all these artifacts, I was blown out because those are I'm from Nigeria, and from my childhood, those are the things that we were reading in European books that we've never seen before. And then coming to the Yale Art Gallery and going to the Metropolitan Museum and seeing those things vis-a-vis, I was so surprised. And I think that it would be great for this artifact to be seen by the generations that have only heard about it and they've never seen it. And also, I do believe that because those artifacts were not just for the sake of beauty, they were idols that people were worshiping. So it has its own spiritual values. And those spiritual values are still existing into the idols. And sometimes I am amazed how people look at it as a new cool thing or a beautiful object as to a spiritual entity.
I think that there is a wonderful opportunity for us to engage with a wide variety of constituencies, not just in North America, that, across particularly the Western world, that there are so many communities that are divided and polarized around, on ethnic lines. And our institution was initially, it came into being to begin to try to build bridges. But I would love to see our institution working transcontinentally to build bridges, to find ways of convening conversations around these amazing pieces of work. And I think many of the questions around the disparities in the size of collections, around restitution, I mean, these are things that we can work through over a generation, that we can begin to share objects, that we can begin to begin to build a new generation of museums across the continent. Will mean that we can actually have shared acquisition policies as well. That I think if we build a new moment in which there is that trust, it will mean not only that there are benefits for people who visit museums across the continent in that they were getting toured shows, but they will also be having kind of long-term loans of objects, that there may well be the restitution of objects. But it will also mean that for us, in terms of the reinterpretation of our collection, that we will have a whole body of possibilities, of expertise, of people who are in a variety of ways invested in thinking about these sorts of objects in ways that we could not possibly. And I think that, for me, is enormously exciting. And I think that is absolutely in tune with the drives that Warren Robbins had when he founded our institution. Hello. Hello, Amanda.
I have a question for you about private collections. I think just as you're talking about a new generation of scholars and an interest in engaging with the African continent, I think there's a new generation of people inheriting private collections and wondering how they can responsibly have these objects. And my question is, how can the museum help to kind of foster or usher a way that people with private collections can also be part of this dialogue, or also maybe even part of either repatriation or sharing these objects so that they're not kind of cloistered in the way that they've traditionally been in private collections?
Well, I love that as an idea. I mean, we've delivered this survey which we've been trying to chart the numbers of museums and the quality of delivery across the African continent. And there simply aren't that many museums. There are particularly art museums. There are few enough that we could much more equitably think of ways in which we could share collections, that we can work together, that we can work on loans. But also, I absolutely agree that there is an opportunity for us to think about ways in which we encourage those people who inherit, those people who get to a point where they want to relinquish their collections, that we could find ways of them finding paths back to homes in Africa. And I think that would be something which would actually kind of not just be good for the peoples of Africa, but I think it would actually be cathartic for many people who have these collections. It would be a wonderful way of thinking of these objects having a new chapter of their life.
Good. Let me once again invite you upstairs for a reception and to thank Dr. Casely-Hayford.
Thank you.